It's important to know how the gospel first spread. In this 16-minute video, you will learn how the gospel spread before it was put in writing, who the key missionaries were, the consensus of New Testament scholars today on the dates the Gospels were written, what events led up to the written Gospels, questions and answers about the processes of oral and written transmission, and whose eyewitness testimony is within the Gospel of Mark. I'm Gene Vanderzanden, author of Mark's Passion, an interesting historical novel about St. Mark and his times. The spread of the gospel was an amazing marvel by any standard. Stories of Jesus circulated all over the Mediterranean world by Peter and other apostles and by Paul. Paul's journeys, which are shown in this map, were in the late 40s through the 50s AD. Peter and others had actually traveled before Paul. This painting by Raphael fairly well depicts what it was like. Here is Paul coming into Athens, finding a place where he could preach to the people there and telling them about Jesus. Some liked what they heard. They wanted more from Paul and asked him questions. Others had doubts and walked away. And there emerged two presumed early written gospel sources, a saying source and a passion document. These sources no longer exist today, but New Testament scholars believe they did exist and were developed before the gospel was fully put in writing. The saying source, as it sounds, was an accumulation of paragraphs and sentences that people who were eyewitnesses had heard Jesus say. They were gathered probably not by one person, but by several people over a period of time. And the Passion document, this reflects how the story of Christ's passion, from the agony in the garden through his crucifixion, has kind of a nice continuous flow from start to finish, like it had been written by one person at one time. So New Testament scholars today believe that these were the first two primitive texts preceding the written Gospels. This chart shows the scholarly consensus on dates, and it has become a true consensus of mainline Protestant scholars, Roman Catholic scholars, Orthodox scholars, and even Jewish scholars who participate in this kind of research. They believe that Mark's Gospel was put in writing between 64 and 69 AD during the buildup of the Jewish rebellion against Rome. They believe that Matthew and Luke were put in the writing in the 80s, and John was even later in the 90s AD. Well, how did they determine this? Beginning in Germany in the mid-20th century, New Testament scholars began a more scientific analysis of the oldest documents and fragments that could still be examined. They looked for clues within the lines, things like the spelling of names, the spelling of places, idioms used in the language, and images of known historical events that may have been referred to either explicitly or implied. They put it all together and came up with this model, and it is the model that has become the most well accepted now by the majority of New Testament scholars. Now, this isn't the way that the Christian community originally looked at it. From the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians believed that Matthew was written first, and then Mark and Luke and John. That was the accepted order. So when scholars came up with this model in the mid-20th century, it was something new, and it has taken a while for it to reach us in the pews. As these dates began to be circulated in the mid-20th century, other New Testament scholars said, "Hey, this explains a lot. It explains why Mark's Gospel even exists. If Mark came after Matthew, what was its purpose? It's shorter. It doesn't have as many of the sayings of Christ in it. It really doesn't convey as much information as Matthew. On the other hand, if Mark's gospel came first, then Mark was the pioneer. Mark put a part of what was known about Christ in writing, as much as he wanted to put in writing, and Matthew and Luke followed, taking what they could from Mark and adding things they were aware of that they thought would round out the story for people to hear. And what were those additional parts? Well, the sayings of Christ that we talked about a moment ago, sayings like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs," and "Love your enemies, do good to those who harm you." And each of these evangelists had additional material they had acquired. Matthew has the genealogy of Jesus right at the beginning, and the story of the wise men. And Luke has the story of the conception and birth of Jesus and the parable of the prodigal son. Do you see the dotted green box with a Q in the middle? Well, that represents the saying source. So Matthew, when he wrote his gospel, he drew on a copy of Mark and he drew upon Q. And Luke, when he put his gospel in writing, he drew upon Mark and he drew upon Q. What's the Q, you might ask? Well, Q is the first letter of the German word for source. The Germans began to call this source, which doesn't exist today, they called it Q, and that stuck. It stuck until the present day, and I suspect that it will continue to stick with us for some time to come. So what you see on this chart is important for you to remember. Q, those are the sayings of Jesus that had been accumulated even before Mark put his gospel in writing. When I get to this point in a live presentation, I ask, for how many of you is this something you've heard about? And for how many is this new? And I get about the same number of hands raised in each group. So if this is something that is new to you, really study this chart. So much of what else is said about the gospel will become much more meaningful when you get this down. And if this is something you've heard before, really get it down well, because the more familiar you are with this model, the more that everything else will make sense. Okay, so what led up to the written Gospels? They had been preached orally for more than 30 years. What triggered Mark to put it all into a written narrative? Well, first of all, those who saw Jesus, who saw his miracles and heard his teaching, were getting old. A person who was the same age as Jesus would be in his mid to late 60s. They didn't have much more time. Yes, that certainly was one of the reasons. The second factor was that the expectation that Christ would return soon began to wane. When Paul wrote his letter to the Thessalonians early on, he believed that Christ would be coming back to earth very soon, within his lifetime. But when he wrote his later letters, like the letter to the Romans, he didn't mention any timing. St. Paul certainly believed, as we do today, that Christ will return. Jesus promised to do so, but he no longer was predicting that this would be soon. And probably, most importantly, the single thing that put Mark to work writing his narrative was the execution of Peter and Paul by the Romans. These executions occurred within a few months of each other in late 64 and early 65 AD. Here's a painting by Caravaggio, the Renaissance Italian painter, showing Peter being cruelly raised into that upside-down position as he was executed by the Romans. These three events led to the putting of the gospel in writing. Now, for most of us, this model of the dates, the charts, and the events leads to questions. It certainly did for me as I was studying at Seattle University during the 80s and 90s. It led to a number of questions. I'll share them with you, and I'll share some of the answers that I found. First of all, the new model moves us away from the classic understanding of inspiration. The classic understanding, I believe, is well depicted in this illustration from a 9th century German Bible. It shows Mark seated at a table with an open book, and there's a winged lion hovering over him, telling him what to write. That's kind of the ancient and well-known and classic understanding of inspiration by the Holy Spirit. But it isn't the way that the church sees inspiration today. This painting by Otino in 17th century France is probably a little closer to our current understanding. It shows Mark seated with a book and a quill pen, and Peter standing over him, telling him what to write. We don't know how much of the eyewitness testimony of Peter was actually dictated in this manner, but it moves us to a better understanding of inspiration. Both Mark and Peter were inspired by the Holy Spirit. Their faith came from the Holy Spirit. The impetus for them to preach and spread the gospel came from the Holy Spirit. And what they left us was guided by the Holy Spirit. But they weren't being controlled like puppets on a string. The Spirit wasn't guiding Mark's hand while he had his eyes closed. It wasn't channeling. No, it was more a kind of a cooperation, a synergy between the Holy Spirit and the human being that produced the biblical text. That's the church's understanding of inspiration by the Holy Spirit today. A second concern that I had as I was studying at Seattle University was a concern about the unreliability of oral transmission. During the 80s and 90s, while I was studying there, scholars were giving little emphasis to eyewitness testimony, and I got uneasy about all that transmission of a single message, how it may have become faulty. At times I felt like I was walking out onto a frozen lake and the ice was getting thinner and thinner. I was afraid that it might break and I'd fall through in my faith. Of course, in each city there were bishops and presbyters whose job it was to faithfully pass on the tradition they had received. And people at that time were better at remembering and repeating what they heard than we are now. And the traveling missionaries like St. Paul and others who went from city to city may have had notes with a few keywords they could recognize that would help them to remember the most important points. And the main concern that developed for me was the question, where is the eyewitness testimony? I wanted to know that there was accurate eyewitness testimony about Jesus at the base of the Gospels. Well, others were thinking about that question too. And beginning in the 1990s and continuing into the 21st century, new scholarship emerged around that question. This research confirmed that the eyewitness testimony of Peter is what is present in Mark's Gospel, and therefore in Matthew and Luke. And this scholarship has confirmed that the eyewitness accounts of John are present in that Gospel. So yes, Mark's Gospel contains the eyewitness memories of Peter. Mark spent years at the side of Peter, serving as his aide and interpreter. And the stories are about Peter and his friends, particularly James and John. Mark's terminology is not Pauline. The accounts don't seem to come from Paul, nor do they have the concerns of St. Paul in them. And there's little about Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Mary Magdalene. They appear in Mark's Gospel. They are important people in Mark's Gospel, but the stories do not seem to derive from either Mary, the mother of Jesus, nor from Mary Magdalene. It would have been nice for us to know what they could tell us, but what we have is what we have. So, how can you follow up on all this? Well, one thing would be to read my historical novel, Mark's Passion, the story of Mark and how he put the gospel in writing. It has accurate depictions of the historical events of the time. You can also get free articles and illustrations at my website, markspassion.com. There's a PDF entitled The World of the First Century that's just loaded with illustrations, images, and maps. And there's an article about what New Testament scholars are saying today that covers in down-to-earth language the new model of the progression of the written text from Mark to Matthew and Luke and to John. You'll also find a ton of links to study sources, so check them out today. If you look just below this video, you'll see the links. Check out Mark's Passion on Amazon.com. You'll have fun learning much, much more. Click on the Amazon.com link below this video to go order my book, Mark's Passion. And thanks for watching.